Thank you for coming tonight. I very much appreciate the very large turnout. By the way, the reason I'm wearing a jacket is my office is in Thailand. It's very warm there. It's very cold here. And I'm originally from Florida, which is like Thailand, very warm. There's a lot of topics that I would like to discuss tonight, but we will focus on the IWG. Before we get to the IWG, I'll introduce myself because I think most people here probably have no idea who I actually am. As I mentioned before, I'm an American. I'm from Florida. I was born in Florida. I've traveled around the United States extensively to 48 of the 50 states. And that's important to mention because you will see the comfort women issues that we have coming from the United States come from very discrete areas, very definite areas. And there are demographic reasons for some of this. You'll see that the United States, if you've traveled around it much, is actually very complicated demographically. But a little bit more about my background. When I was younger, I was in the Army for 5 years. I was in Special Forces. I left the Army after 5 years and eventually started a business in the country of Poland. I never dreamed of becoming a writer. So I actually had another life before I came into writing or journalism. And by the way, in the United States, I never identify myself as a journalist. What I do is actually a little different, but I think in Japan the proper identification would be journalist. And you know, after I left the United States, I also traveled around the world quite a lot, to about 70 countries, 70, including about 20 countries in Asia. So I've seen quite a lot of different types of people. I've seen everything from cannibals to terrorists to Taliban, and I have to say there are some very good people out in the world too, and Japan is probably the nicest country I've ever been to. It's so safe and friendly here. I just wanted to say that after all those 70 countries, this is such a great place to be. You're lucky. You're definitely lucky people. And so after I was in business for a while, I made sufficient money that I decided to do something else. I would like to be an astronaut, but I wasn't qualified. So I decided to go into writing. So after the Army and business, I started writing in about 1996, I believe. I published my first book in 1999, and it did quite well. And since that time, I was traveling more around the world, especially in Asia, to places like India, China, Nepal, many, many countries. And mostly I was traveling just to learn about different types of people. For instance, when I was in Nepal, I would walk. I was much thinner then. I put on some weight. But I would walk for hundreds of miles out in the mountains. And I even hired some people to carry my books for me. Today I would use an iPad. And then 9/11 happened. And as you know, that was a very big moment for the United States. I actually briefly considered going back into the military, but I didn't think my skills would be very useful at that point. I mean, there comes a time when you have to defend your country, as everybody in this room is aware right now, and that time is now for Japan as well. But I did not go off to the war, actually, at that point. In 2000, the war began in 2001. In 2004, two of my friends were killed one day after the other. One was killed one day and one was killed the next. And one of my friends was Scott Helvenston. He was the Navy SEAL who was killed in Fallujah and hung from the bridge. So I stopped what I was doing and I went to their funerals. One funeral was in Colorado and the other was in Florida. At one funeral, the one in Florida for Scott, there was a lot of Navy SEALs because he had been a SEAL. Actually, he was the youngest SEAL in history. And they asked me why I was not in the war, writing about the war, because the media was not telling the truth about the war. And I said, I'm not going to the war because it's very dangerous and my life is very, very good right now. And then I went to the other funeral in Colorado, and those were Green Berets there. because my other friend who was killed, Richard Ferguson, I was in special forces with him. And the Green Berets, many I knew because we were friends, asked the same question, why don't you go to the war? And that was April of 2004, and that was when Fallujah, the Abu Ghraib war crimes became known. And we attacked Fallujah. And so at that point, in April of 2004, the war just exploded. Casualties went up tremendously. Terrorists were coming in from all over Africa and the Middle East to fight the USA. But I still refused to go to the war. And then that was April of 2004. In November of 2004, we attacked Fallujah again, and this time practically flattened it. So at that point, I knew we were losing the war, and I did not trust the media, which is why I'm standing in front of you. I still do not trust most of the media, although there are some very good journalists, and I decided to go to Iraq myself. And there was a great deal of combat. I arrived in December of 2004 and immediately got into heavy combat, and I was in combat for the next 8 months. And during this time, with no media affiliations at all, I was just there myself. I started a blog, and I picked up millions of readers around the world. I then went over to Afghanistan and reported back some things that nobody wanted to hear. I reported back in 12 major articles that we were losing the war. That was 2006. I headed back to Iraq at that point, and the military would not let me in. They were upset about what I had written. So I wrote bad things about the military, and they let me in. So I was there through most of 2007 for the surge. You might remember that. The war in Iraq started to turn around, and we actually started to win it. And I started just going back and forth between Iraq and Afghanistan and reporting what was happening over to the Philippines and some other places. And somewhere along the way, the New York Times said I had done this. You could find the article more than anybody else. I was really spending a huge amount of time with combat forces from the British, United States, and also Lithuanians, also Iraqis and Afghans and Filipinos. And so after that, the war started. Eventually, I decided that the war in Afghanistan was fruitless, and I'm just risking my life for nothing. It's going to turn out badly. So I started covering Thailand. As you could see, just last year, Thailand was on the verge of civil war, but now it's actually quite peaceful. And so somewhere along the way, people recognized my work who were also working on the comfort women issue. And they realized that strategic interest like this might interest me. So one person who had been researching this for quite a long time had arranged for funding for a funder, and they flew to Thailand to brief me. So they briefed me for 3 days on the comfort women issue. Actually, at first, I did not want to meet with them because I thought the comfort women issue was very small and something from the past, and I didn't understand why anybody was even paying attention to it. So I refused to meet them at first, actually. And then finally, after a long Skype call, I said, there might be something to this. And they were sending me documents to read, and finally, that was when I agreed to meet on this issue. And after the meetings in Bangkok, I said, well, I'll look at this because I didn't know who to believe, actually. The comfort women issue obviously has been going on for a long time, and it's complex. But I did agree to look at it, so I looked at it and researched it on my own and decided there really was some geopolitical interest here that were strategic in nature. They didn't just deal with the comfort women issue. There was something much larger going on. And the comfort women issue was actually just a subset, and actually even a small part of it, but a very emotional part. Now keep in mind, during the early part, I didn't know whether it was true or not, so I was totally a blank slate on whether or not this had actually occurred. So when I decided to take the next step, I flew from Thailand to the United States, went to Glendale, spent quite a bit of time in Los Angeles talking with key people, went to the statue there. There was actually some Japanese communists at the statue. They had read an advertisement in the Akahara, which was just a coincidence that they were there when I came. and their tour was being led by KAFCA, which is the Korean American Forum of California. So a couple of Korean people were actually just telling them the details of the statue. We then flew back to Tokyo and had quite a lot of meetings here in Tokyo with people who have been studying the issue for many years. And after seeing a great deal of evidence, I also flew to the Philippines on my own, by the way, researching it. And I'm not even anywhere near finished researching this issue. We have a couple of Thai researchers working on it in Thailand at this point. And actually, everywhere we look, it's become clear that this is a false narrative. It's completely fake, which you probably knew 20 years ago, but I did not. But the big question is, why would anybody spend so much effort to do this? Why would they spend so much effort to malign Japan like this? And, well, I'm prepared to answer that. But first, I would like to say a lot of people, especially military people, military officers and people that have been in the military for a long time, and business people, are very open to more information about this, I've noticed. Many of the military people actually fill in the blanks when I'm speaking with them. They say, within 5 minutes, they say, this is obviously not true. And I'll explain why. There's a saying in warfare that the simplest things are the hardest. So if your commander says, hey, Captain so-and-so, you need to move these 20 cannons 20 kilometers and you have 2 days to do it. And then it starts to rain and the road is muddy and you can't move the cannons and you lose the battle. I mean, the simplest things were the hardest in Iraq and Afghanistan. Often things that seem very simple are very hard. Every general that I've known from the military, whether it's the Army or the Navy or the Air Force, they always say, I need more ships, I need more airplanes, I need more soldiers or more tanks, right? They're always asking for more because they need more. And this is where common sense comes into play. During World War II, Japan was being attacked, obviously, by the United States, Australia, the UK, and others. And there were supply problems. Some soldiers were starving. There were not enough. There wasn't even enough ammunition. No commander in his right mind would stop to kidnap 200,000 women. That makes no sense. And every military person will immediately say, this is bull. So kidnapping 200,000 women, that's only the start. Then you have to transport them, you have to guard them, and you have to feed them while your own soldiers are starving to death. This isn't spring break. That was combat. Another thing that needs to be mentioned when you're speaking with military people or business people about this is that Japan was not a third world army. Japan already had its own aircraft carriers, its own airplanes, and its own submarines from which Japan could launch airplanes and could conduct simultaneous attacks thousands of miles apart. This is a very sophisticated military. The commanders obviously were very smart. They're not going to take time to kidnap people. Another problem with that narrative is there would not be, say, 59 witnesses. There would still be at least many hundreds of thousands. Because as you know, if 200 women were kidnapped on Jeju Island in Korea, everybody on the island would be a witness, not just the women. A coconut cannot fall off a tree without everybody on an island knowing about it. And so the idea that there would only be, these small number of witnesses left is ludicrous. Every village would be filled with witnesses. Every husband and father and brother would also be witnesses. And another problem with the story is why did they not fight the Japanese army? Because if they came to Texas and tried to kidnap 200,000 women, even if the U.S. Army tried that, it would be a big problem for the U.S. Army. So just from a common sense perspective, a lot of people can actually see that it's just untrue. It's just not there. But I still wanted to see the evidence because the reason I picked up millions of readers during the wars is because I had a reputation of getting things correct. And that means a lot of hard work and research, not just using common sense. That means going there and really finding out if your common sense is actually true. Just in the last week, one of our researchers in Thailand uncovered a contract between the Thai government and the Japanese Army for an Ianfu station. And it was a licensed place. It was weekly medical checks, that sort of thing. Some of our research is taking place in other languages, so you can imagine this adds to the difficulty. But I find Thailand, as an example, to be very interesting because when you go to Glendale and you look at the statue there, Thailand is one of the names on the plaque. And so I said, let's find out if Thailand actually has a problem with Japan. So I called up one of the ex-prime ministers, someone that I know, Prime Minister Abhisit, and I asked to meet with him and his deputy of the Democratic Party, who's kind of like the LDP here. And I asked, does Thailand have a problem with Japan on reparations or apologies or any of these sorts of things? And the answer was no, and they were even surprised that I even brought it up. This is a complete non-issue in Thailand. Yet Thailand's name is on the statue, on the plaque. In fact, I found that only 4 countries have a problem with Japan. And you already know what those countries are. North and South Korea, China, who's basically a criminal country, and Japan. And this isn't just organic to Japan. This is the same in every country I go to. The biggest problems in the United States are caused by Americans. And so, this is not a surprise that it's also true of Japan. Okay, so common sense is enough to show many people that this is, especially if they'd been in the military or in business, all business people know that they always want, generals want more troops, businesses want more money, right? So they're not going to waste it on things. And so now comes down to the actual archives. And that's what we're here for tonight. I've gone through all that to set the context of the IWG report. And also I want to make one more context about what this is about on the geopolitical level. Maybe everybody here already knows, but clearly there are many levels of this fight. One level is just racism. People who don't like Japan blame it on Japan. Another level is money. For instance, the attorney, he was Japanese, who went around to Philippines and Indonesia and Malaysia and was trying to work up a lawsuit. Another level is local politics, and this actually becomes very big later. Local politics has many faces here. One is, we see President Park over in Korea. She's not really all there, I think. But she obviously uses it for her own political reasons. A few others, like Mike Honda over in the United States, uses it for his own political reasons. His voting base contains many Koreans and many Chinese, but not many Japanese, so you can see where that's going. So there's these various layers, and then once we get to the highest layer, that is China. China's fingerprints are all over this, everywhere we look, including in the IWG. China is in there. And I mean as an active participant in the process of the IWG. Korea is like the glove, and China is the hand in this. So you see these Korean groups in Glendale and other places down in Australia. We've learned there's a similar problem. But you see that the big hand of China is always there. And China is running a massive information operation, of which the comfort women issue is just a small part. Another part is, of course, Nanjing. Not to go into that, but you can see a similar storyline emerge. And what's this about? It's about the South China Sea, the East China Sea. It's about Senkaku Islands. It's about many things. It's about China emerging. And they need to keep Japan weak. A key to keeping Japan weak is to split relations with the United States and other allies such as Australia, and cause frictions with Korea, which is very easy to do. It's not easy to split relations with the United States, but somehow through their diligence, they're managing to cause some problems, as everybody here knows. And in that regard, I would like to mention Resolution 121, which everyone here probably knows about very well. That resolution is meaningless in the United States. You know, we pass resolutions almost every day, and some of those include things like National Pi Day, 3.14, like pi in the circle. I'm serious. Another one was National Craft Beer Day, which is like homemade beer. I'm saving the best for last. One that was proposed but thankfully didn't pass was Michael Jackson Day. Look it up on the internet. And actually, if you look up ridiculous House resolutions, there is an unbelievable number of things that it will leave foreigners laughing. It leaves me almost crying. If you look behind House Resolution 121, you'll see a similar group of people that are in the Chinese Global Alliance is there in the background again. And of course, Mike Honda is in the forefront. So this meaningless 121, which is very famous in Japan, is it can be used in news stories over and over and over, and it looks like the United States has decided to turn the entire government against Japan. But what it really is happening is local politics. We see Mike Honda and some others using this, and they passed that on the House, and now it's a great news article story. So you can see this beautiful information operation. I would love to go to the school in Beijing and learn how they do this. They managed to cover up the great leap forward in the Cultural Revolution and invade Tibet and do so many other things, and yet the world focuses on comfort women. And so let's get down to real evidence. Let's see. This is actually just one small piece of the information that's available. Has anybody here read the IWG? It's really exciting. I've read it. Actually, when you're researching this issue, it is kind of exciting in a weird way because it's really filled with very interesting information. I'm in hopes that someone will translate this to Japanese so that Japanese journalists can read it. And one thing that's amazing, by the way, about Japan is that much of this movement is, as you know, being done by housewives. Such a powerful force. So having this in Japanese in their hands could, you know, it's a force builder in trying to tell the truth about what's going on. Every day, my Google Net alerts come in. Does anybody here use Google Net alerts? I keep certain keywords that I'm researching plugged in, and so every day when the term comfort women comes up, I get a list of the stories. There were actually a lot more than this today, but it would be too many. Some of them are just about comfortable shoes and that sort of thing, but other stories are clearly about the comfort women issue. But you know, you can always tell if it's going to be a political article or if somebody's actually trying to get to the truth. If it's a political article, they mention Shinzo Abe within the first 3 sentences, and they like to throw in ultra right wing. And as you can see, you know, the Crown Prince made a statement recently about history, but the articles that came out yesterday make it look like he's in opposition to Abe, but when I had a Japanese person read his actual statements and compare it to the stories, they were inconsistent. Sometimes it's difficult to tell the difference between poor journalism and a hit job. A hit job, basically an assassination. As I mentioned earlier, this is a geopolitical move. It has nothing really to do with comfort women. If anybody really cared about human rights of anybody, they wouldn't be concerned about something that did not happen more than 7 decades ago. If they were interested in human rights, they would be focused somewhere else on something else. Clearly, Japan has been one of the most exemplary nations on earth ever since I've been alive. And for some reason, people still find a way to throw rocks at Japan. Interesting, you see, though, with these various attacks on Japan, again, it's about the bases and it's about strategic interest, as you can see. One thing that's interesting about this slide is you can see that they're trying to split even Okinawan women from Japanese women, as if they're something separate. You know, obviously Okinawa is part of Japan, but still they managed to make it look like it's something different. So again, the footprints here of something larger afoot are just obvious. They're everywhere. It's become a cornerstone issue. As you can see, it's become a major issue. It's in the news literally every day. While China works on its aircraft carriers, they're trying to keep Article 9 as it is. While China builds its military, they're trying to keep Japan as weak as possible. And as you can see, it's created a victim culture in Korea and China. Everybody thinks they're a victim. And it's interesting, too, how the Chinese pretend that they rescued the comfort women. I mean, they could teach Disney World how to make fiction movies. We believe, after looking at this quite a lot, that eventually the target is going to be the United States as well on the comfort women issue. As you know, 122 women in Korea are suing the Korean government now. This is some back feed that the Korean government probably did not expect. And we believe after some period of time, we don't know when, they're going to start doing the same with the United States. Basically, Korea walked into their own ambush, and the United States is following them. The history of the IWG is almost as interesting as the IWG itself. One of the things that's interesting about the history is that at the meetings when they're working on the IWG, you'll see that, for instance, Global Alliance members are mentioned at times. They were there at the meetings. They were actually influencing people, lawmakers in the United States to actually push this thing forward. Now, one thing that's very important is that many of the documents had already been declassified. In fact, most had already been declassified, but the IWG had another 8 million pages declassified. 1.2 million from the OSS, that's the predecessor of the CIA. And you can see the other figures there as well. But also the Navy was involved, the Marines, so they really had access to records from all the service branches. It was a tremendous effort. And again, the history of the report spans back quite a while. For instance, on 2003, Global Alliance is mentioned here. They were all over this thing. It's interesting, too, how they focus on Japan, and that's the reason that this, they focus on Japan more than anybody. And one thing that's very important is when it came to Nazi war crimes, there's enough evidence to fill up this entire library. And yet, after this tremendous effort with tens of millions of dollars spent, we didn't find anything on the comfort women. Notice these names here. You might want to write them down for future research. Maloney and Pelosi, these are key figures who are involved in this issue. And you can see on the bottom line here, expresses the sense of Congress that foreign nations, in particular Japan, they keep focusing on Japan like a laser. You can see that throughout the early parts of the working on the IWG. They're focusing on Japan, even though most of the records actually were from Germany. Notice on the bottom of this slide, again, expresses the sense of Congress that foreign nations, and in particular Japan, should make every effort possible to cooperate with Nazi and Japanese war criminal records Interagency Working Group in carrying out its duties. This is very important. This is important because there's a false narrative that Japan was not helpful and that Japanese archives were not accessible. So you can see, actually this slide talks about that as well. The idea that Japanese records were not accessible is completely false. In fact, we had access to the Japanese war records and had gone through those with 2,600 translators. And so you can see here some of the language. There was just a paucity there was very few records at all about Japanese war crimes. I mean, we knew war crimes happened, of course, and some records were found, but nothing on sex slaves, nothing like that whatsoever. Now, some people say that the IWG, the ones who have heard of the IWG, they say that the only thing that the IWG did was declassify the records. That's not true. In fact, they went through the records in detail, and they identified the records and cataloged and inventoried those records. So they actually did go through the records. And at one point, they actually apologized in the final report to Global Alliance. I was actually on an airplane reading the IWG report and read the apology to Global Alliance. I was stunned that after we spent tens of millions of dollars on this report, we're apologizing to the Chinese because we can't slam Japan with it. You've got to read this report. It's stunning. First, I'll tell you a story about something that happened in Glendale. It's very interesting. I was looking for the statue, and I didn't quite know where it was. It's near the library in Glendale. And since I had just come in from Thailand, my phone did not work in California. In the old days, I would carry a map, but these days we carry an iPhone, right? So I was only about maybe 125 meters away from the statue, but I could not find it. This is very interesting. So there was two well-dressed gentlemen there. They were getting into a very nice car. And I asked, where's the Comfort Women statue? I said, excuse me, do you know where the Comfort Women statue is? They had no idea what I was talking about. I said, are you from Glendale? And they said, yes. I said, were you born here all your life? They said, yes. Both of them said they'd been there all their life. And then one said, what's Comfort Women? I was actually a little shocked that they hadn't heard of Comfort Women. I said, well, never mind. But then they actually found it on their phone, and they showed me where it was. Well, that was very interesting because here's two guys from Glendale that don't even know about the statue that everybody in Japan knows about. I was shaking my head, too. I was just stunned. But those are the kinds of things you can only learn by actually going someplace. That even local people might not know about it. And I want to say one other thing before going into the back to the IWG, which is going to become even more interesting here. You've probably heard about the McGraw-Hill textbook issue recently. Prime Minister Abe has actually even mentioned that, I believe. One thing that you need to understand about the United States and textbooks is that we fight a lot about textbooks, and I think Japanese also fight a lot about textbooks. And we fight about what's going to be taught in schools. Every country seems to do this. And don't feel bad. Israel was recently erased off the map in a textbook. Did you see that in the news? That was for some country in the Middle East. And the Israelis, obviously were very upset. So we've had these issues many times before. Now, of course, there's an issue about the East Sea versus the Japan Sea. There's also been issues about whether or not to call the Arabian Gulf or the Persian Gulf. These issues happen all over the world. The third biggest terrorist strike in the United States occurred in 1927. It happened in a place called Bath, Michigan. An American man who was clearly a little bit crazy was angry about some school issues. One of those was taxes, another was what was being taught in school. So he blew up the school. He blew up the entire school. Yeah, he spent months, I think it was 6 months, it's been a while since I've read the archives, but hiding dynamite under the school. So these issues in the United States have been going on for a long time. And usually it doesn't result in terrorism, but we fight about textbooks constantly. Normally it's about something else, like should we talk about God in school? And, some people still think that it's wrong to actually acknowledge that dinosaurs existed. That's America. So, these issues are ongoing. And so we're always fighting whether or not we should talk about, Israel's right to exist in schools or those sorts of things. These issues come up constantly. This year, one happens to be Comfort Women. But when you put this in the broader context, I know the Comfort Women issue looks very big, with the McGraw-Hill textbook. But when you put it into the broader context, it's actually a very tiny thing in the United States. It's almost background noise. And so it might look like Americans are constantly just saying something bad about Japan, but believe me, that's not true, unless they're Korean Americans. And then, of course, you might have some issues. It's interesting that the real revisionists are the ones who are calling the people who know that this is fake. They're calling you revisionists. The real revisionists are the ones that made up this fiction to begin with. Back to IWG. And again, the history of the IWG is as interesting as the IWG report itself. And the annexes also are fascinating. So you see here in the meeting in 2003, March 2003, Global Alliance is mentioned again. These are minutes of a meeting that deal with IWG, creating the IWG. So you can see that they anticipate, it says right here, tremendous disappointment over the relatively few classified documents on the Asian front that have been located. And specifically, they're talking about Global Alliance will be disappointed. Well, who cares what Global Alliance thinks? Obviously, the people doing this report cared because Global Alliance was constantly there. And I believe that, and I believe others here will believe the same, that many people actually believe that there was a sex slave trade going on. They're true believers. They're wrong, but they're not lying. They're just wrong. And this is an interesting line for those who can read English. Many activists within the Global Alliance and the Asian American community had assumed that through IWG efforts, a large number of documents would be found, but such has not been the case. The next sentence is also extremely interesting. Many of these interested citizens lack a sense of closure and are concerned about a cover-up and lack of high-level interest in the Asian theater. Now, check out the date on this report and remember what was going on in that year. The United States was at war. We were in war in Afghanistan and Iraq, and in fact, and many other places. But this was a particularly, obviously, big one. And so they're worried about lack of high-level interest while we've got a war unfolding. The last thing that anybody cares about was the IWG report or Global Alliance. I mean, we were concerned more about Taliban and Al-Qaeda, of course. But here are these guys thinking that they're at the center of the universe and that Washington should stop what they're doing to help the Chinese and Koreans sue Japan. And here's another meeting in 2004. And here, again, we see they're talking about including the fact that a relatively small number of documents relating to Japanese war crimes remained classified at the beginning of the IWG. Most of the records, as we know, had already been declassified before the IWG. And again, we get nothing, nothing, nothing every step of the way. And so the only thing that they can think of is that it's a cover-up. Well, we didn't cover up for the Nazis, did we? And so, obviously there's everywhere we look, we're finding nothing. One of the things that they've done in the IWG, when they couldn't find anything, or in other reports as well, they would mention other places to look, such as books. Yeah, I mean, you're educated people, that's why you're laughing, but a lot of people don't laugh. They say, okay, that's normal. Why would the National Archives care what Iris Chong has to say? They should be going through, she should be in their archives. It just goes on and on. You can't make this stuff up. As you can see, they mentioned George Hicks as well. And so actually inside the IWG, and I want to say it at least 2 or 3 more times, I hope somebody will translate this to English, the IWG. Japanese. And one thing that you'll see early in the report, it may be page 26, I'm not sure, but they actually mention what they're looking for. They're looking for Nazi war crimes. They're looking for comfort women issues. They're looking for evidence about Nanjing, and they specifically mention Iris Chung. And they're looking for evidence regarding Unit 731. All again, and every one of these holes where we go fishing, we're not catching fish. So, but they actually mentioned that. That's very important to always point out that they specifically say they were looking for this, because many people say that they were not. And then the next thing they say was that the documents were not cataloged. They were cataloged. This is a repeat of something I've said, but it's important. The allegations arose that the U.S. government engaged in a cover-up in order to conceal incriminating documents pertaining to war crimes in order not to embarrass the Japanese government. And Everybody here knows that the United States government has not made many efforts not to embarrass the Japanese government. Okay. And you can see, again, exhaustive searches by several agencies for classified materials conducted independently of outside political interference. Okay, so independently of outside political interference of any sort, followed the guidelines imposed by the IWG. They found no evidence to support such assertions of a cover-up. We know that there were some issues down in Indonesia, right? And those were found in the Dutch survey, which were an anomaly. There's one thing, to have some soldiers commit crimes here and there. That's always going to happen. Every army is going to do that. But it clearly was not systematic. I recently read that the United States had basically raped its way across Iraq and Afghanistan. I spent 4 years in the wars, and I only heard about one rape, and it was real. It actually happened. They do happen, but they weren't as common as a lot of people make out. But when somebody makes the accusation, many people instantly believe it, that the United States is out there raping, which they're not doing. Although we do have actually sexual assault problems within the military, which are pretty serious. We'll set up why the Japanese government set up the Ianfu stations. To reduce problems with the local population. You are dealing with young men here. To reduce venereal diseases and espionage. And rest assured, the first people that get recruited are prostitutes. For instance, we were recruiting Iraqi prostitutes as spies. It's normal. So, I mean, it's actually smart in this context. And as we know, it was not illegal back then. And so that's something that's important to point out always, that the context of the time was different than now. The USA actually ran a similar system in Honolulu on Hotel Street. One of our illustrious commanders, Colonel David Hackworth, actually did similar in Vietnam, which didn't make a lot of people happy, but he did it. And anybody who's been in the military, or at least the U.S. military, knows that if you open a base up, prostitutes come. You practically have to put guards on the base to keep them off the base. So we know that actually some coercion definitely occurred. We know that. I think everybody here knows that. But it wasn't widespread. One of the things that's interesting about the IWG, for instance, the Koreans reported it, and you saw the talk from the Crown Prince, 2 days ago now? And you saw immediately how that was reinterpreted right in front of everybody, right? I mean, it was immediately misinterpreted like it's some friction between him and Abe. And that's right in front of everybody right now. So, for instance, at least one Korean newspaper did mention the IWG and immediately twisted it as if there's evidence and proof, when we know, anybody who's actually read it, that it's quite the opposite. This is interesting. More recent State Department records released by the IWG contain a collection of news clippings. A collection of news clippings and press summaries from the 1980s and 90s. And some of these are discussing compensation claims by groups representing former victims of Japanese enforced prostitution. They're so sloppy and desperate for evidence that they actually cite newspaper clippings. We see what's happening with Asahi. How many people here are suing Asahi? So let's take clippings from Asahi and use those as evidence. I mean, this is the kind of, they're really reaching low when they do these, mentioning these books that are suspect to begin with, news clippings. This is why I became an independent writer to begin with, because I didn't trust them, and here they go again. The 731 is I think everybody here has heard of Unit 731. There's similar dramas unfolding there. Some of these annexes actually, the history of the IWG is really interesting. Because you see, for instance, Global Alliance all over it. They're mentioned in the meetings minutes. And then the IWG report, the final report in 2007, is its own fascinating story where we apologize to Global Alliance. And then the annexes also are very interesting. And so to try to get your arms around the IWG report, you really have to study all three areas: the history, the report itself, and the annexes. I want to mention one other thing about Global Alliance. When we went to Glendale, we met with Dr. Mira. Many of you probably know who he is. He's filed several lawsuits. So we were talking about the lawsuit, and he mentioned that Global Alliance had filed an amicus. The lawyers here will know what an amicus curiae is, but maybe some other people don't. An amicus is something, it's a friend of the court document. Basically, outside, supposedly disinterested third parties can write to the court and explain their expertise on a subject. And I found it stunning that inside of Dr. Mira's files was that amicus from Global Alliance. And so I asked him for a copy of the amicus, which I read. And I can assure you it was also very exciting. Actually, it was very well written and very persuasive. So if you came into this not knowing the topic, I think if you read the amicus, you would leave going, yeah, these guys probably got a point, that there really were sex slaves. Because most of the amicus was actually truth. They used mostly truth, and then they put in that 10% of false information. And they're really good writers as well. Those attorneys must have cost a lot. Probably everybody here has read Report 49. That's a perfect example of looking for prostitutes to use as spies or for information. And then, of course, the Dutch survey is another important document. One thing that I've noticed that's making it difficult to bring the truth to bear on this issue. This is a global fight. It's happening in many places. It's happening in Germany, Netherlands, and France, and Australia, obviously in the United States. And in many of the places, the Korean and Chinese influence, especially Chinese, can be very large. There's a fight going on in Australia that sounds very similar to the fight in California. They're almost mirrors from what I've been able to derive. And the local politics are very important because often the Chinese and Koreans have larger voting bases. So they've got that political clout. The fight that's unfolding in Australia is particularly interesting. I'm going to go down there and check that one out as well. But one thing that needs to be addressed is infighting. The people who are trying to get the truth out about this matter are outnumbered. They're very outnumbered by the people who are trying to use the issue for political reasons. And so that's very important. They've got more numbers, they've got more votes, and they've got more money. They've got more in every way. And they've had a head start. And so what's very important is, and I see this happening, it's actually affecting my ability to research, is infighting among Japanese. This fight can be won. The Chinese who are telling these lies are vulnerable in various ways. One is that practically nobody trusts the Chinese government, unless they're talking bad about Japan, which is very weird. And so that is a vulnerability. We all know that nobody trusts the Chinese government, period. Even Chinese people usually don't seem to trust it. And so once we point these things out, that this is an information operation, once it's laid out to people, then you can start to see it. But not until somebody, like for instance, I knew about a lot of the issues, but I didn't realize the pattern until somebody showed it to me. And then I started to study myself, and I said, yeah, that's true. I see the pattern. It's very obvious that it's actually true. And so the IWG is just one small part of this. We could go on for days and days and days. But I just wanted to mention that the infighting thing is very damaging. And with that, I would like to conclude, and I really appreciate everyone coming tonight.